Greetings students, welcome to part 4 Nervous System Physiology. This is Assistant Professor Dr. Ghaithali Jasim. Today we will talk about the spinal cord. Every spinal segment is associated with a pair of dorsal root ganglia that contain the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. The dorsal roots, which contain the axon of the neurons, they bring sensory information to the spinal cord. A pair of ventral roots that contain the axons of the motor neurons, which extend to the periphery, controlling somatic and visceral effectors. So we can see from this illustration there are two dorsal root and dorsal root ganglia, and also two ventral roots from the spinal cord. On both sides or either sides of the dorsal and ventral roots of each spinal segment pass through the intervertebral foramen. These are the spinal nerves. Distal to each dorsal ganglion, the sensory and motor roots are brought together into a single spinal nerve. Spinal nerves are mixed nerves because they contain both efferent sensory and efferent motor fibers. There are 31 pairs of the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves take the name of the segment of the vertebrae that they pass through. So, for example, thoracic 1, thoracic 2, or cervical 1, 2, and lumbar and sacral nerves. So, spinal nerves, the cervical spinal nerves from 1 to 8, thoracic spinal nerves from 1 to 12, thoracic spinal nerves, the lumbar spinal nerves from L1 to L5, there are 5 pairs, and the sacral spinal nerves also from 1 to 5. Each carries the name of the vertebrae it passes through. In this illustration we can find the spinal nerve, how the ventral and dorsal roots come together to develop a spinal nerve where both sensory and motor fibers can run together through the nerve, which is the mixed nerve. The spinal meninges or spinal membranes. These provide the physical stability and shock absorption, and blood vessels branching within these layers also deliver oxygen and nutrients to the spinal cord. There are 3 meningeal layers. First, the dura mater. Second, the arachnoid. Third, the pia mater. These are continuous to the cranial meninges of the brain. We can see here in the blue or light blue the spinal meninges, how they surround the spinal cord and the dorsal root and ventral root ganglia. Sectional organization of the spinal cord. The anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus mark the division between the left and right sides of the spinal cord. The superficial white matter contains large number of myelinated and non-myelinated axons, while the gray matter contains the cell bodies of the neurons, and the projections of the gray matter towards the outer surface of the spinal cord are called the horns. So the gray matter, the cell bodies of neurons in the gray matter of the spinal cord are organized into functional groups called nuclei. There are sensory nuclei, receive and relay sensory information from the peripheral receptors, and the motor nuclei, they issue motor commands to the peripheral effectors. So the posterior or dorsal gray horns contain somatic and visceral sensory nuclei, while the anterior and ventral gray horns contain somatic motor nuclei, and the lateral gray horn, located only in the thoracic and lumbar segments, these contain visceral motor nuclei. We can see here in the right side the colored horns, where we can see the sensory nuclei and the motor nuclei, both somatic and visceral. The white matter can be divided into three regions called columens: posterior white column, anterior white column, and the lateral white column. Another subject also regarding the spinal cord is the reflexes. What are reflexes? Reflexes, they are rapid automatic responses to a specific stimuli, while the neural reflexes, in which sensory fibers delivers information to the CNS and motor fibers commands to the peripheral effectors. We can see in the illustration below where in red sensory information are carried to the central nervous system or spinal cord, then in green the motor commands are delivered to the effector. What's the reflex arch? A reflex arch begins at a receptor and ends at a peripheral effector, such as a muscle fiber or gland cell. There are 5 steps involving in a neural reflex. Step number 1, arrival of stimulus and activation of a receptor. Receptors are specialized cells or dendrites of a sensory neuron. The receptors are sensitive to physical or chemical changes in the body or to external environment. If there is a pain stimulus, there will be activation to the pain receptor. Step number 2, activation of a sensory neuron. Stimulation of pain receptor lead to formation and propagation of an action potential along the axon of the sensory neurons. Information reaches the spinal cord with one of the dorsal roots. So step number 1 and 2 involve the same neuron or a different neuron. For example, in loud sound, a reflex is triggered when receptor releases a neurotransmitter that stimulates a second neuron. Step number 3, information processing. It begins when a neurotransmitter is released by the synaptic knob and affects the postsynaptic membrane of an interneuron producing an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Sometimes the sensory neuron innervates a motor neuron directly. Step number 4, activation of a motor neuron. The axons of the stimulated motor neurons carry action potentials into the periphery over the ventral root of the spinal cord. Step number 5, response of the peripheral effector. Release of a neurotransmitter by the motor neurons at the synaptic knob will cause response by the peripheral effector. For example, if it's a skeletal muscle, there will be contraction. Here we can see this illustration of a receptor, of a pain receptor. If it's activated, the sensory neuron will carry action potential to cause depolarization and action potential generation in the interneuron, in which will activate a motor neuron and cause development of an action potential in the motor neuron that causes a stimulation to the effector. In here it's a muscle. Here another example of a reflex, but this is a more complicated one, where a muscle spindle acts as a sensory neuron. A stimulation of the sensory neuron causes carrying of an action potential to the spinal cord, where it innervates directly a motor neuron, causing a contraction in the quadriceps, the biggest muscle in the leg, and other sensory information could be carried to the brain. The classification of reflexes could be according to their development or to the site where information processing occurs, or it could be depending on the nature of the resulting motor response, or it could be classified according to the complexity of the neural circuit involved. First, according to the development of the reflex. There are two types. The innate reflexes result from connections that form between neurons during the development. For example, removing your hand from a hot plate and blinking when your eyelashes are touched. These are both innate reflexes. Acquired reflexes, these are more learned motor patterns than they are pre-established. These motor responses are rapid and automatic, but they are learned rather than pre-established. For example, a driver steps on the brake when trouble appears on the road. According to the processing site, it's divided into spinal reflexes. The spinal reflex, the important interconnections and processing occur inside the spinal cord, while the cranial reflexes, the reflex proceed in the brain, for example, movement in response to loud noise or bright lights. The classification according to the nature of the response: we have the somatic reflex, mechanism of involuntary control of the muscular system, and we have the visceral reflex or autonomic reflex control activities of other systems. According to the complexity of the circuit, the monosynaptic reflex, it is the simplest reflex arch. The sensory neuron synapses directly on a motor neuron, which itself serves as a processing center. For example, the stretch reflex, knee jerk reflex, or patella reflex because of the presence of muscle spindle, the sensory receptors. The other type, the polysynaptic reflexes, it have at least one interneuron between the sensory and motor neurons. For example, the tendon reflex, presence of a sensory receptor on the tendon called Golgi tendon organs. These stimulate inhibition of interneurons that innervate motor neurons of the skeletal muscle. This brings us to the brain. Okay, let's see. The brain is divided into cerebrum, responsible for conscious thought processes, intellectual functions, memory storage and processing, conscious and subconscious regulation of skeletal muscle contractions. These are the functions of the cerebrum. While the cerebellum is responsible for coordinating complex somatic motor patterns, adjust output of other somatic motor centers in the brain and spinal cord. The diencephalon. The thalamus, relay and processing centers of sensory information. The hypothalamus, center controlling emotions and autonomic functions and hormone production. While the mesencephalon, processing of visual and auditory data, generation of reflective somatic motor responses, and maintenance of consciousness is the responsibility of the mesencephalon. The pons, another part of the brain, it relays sensory information to cerebellum and thalamus, and responsible for the subconscious somatic and visceral motor centers. The medulla oblongata relays sensory information to thalamus and to other portions of the brainstem, responsible for the autonomic centers for regulation of visceral functions, cardiovascular, respiratory, and digestive system activities. The cranial meninges. Okay, so the layers that make up the cranial meninges are the dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater. These are continuous with those of the spinal cord, as we see here in the blue color. We can see here the cranium, the bone, then we have the dura mater and the arachnoid and the pia mater. Beneath them there is the brain. The cerebral spinal fluid, the CSF. The CSF completely surrounds and bathes the exposed surface of the CNS, and the CSF has several functions. These are important functions: cushioning delicate structures, also supporting the brain. The brain really floats in the CSF. The human brain weighs about 1,400 grams in the air, but it only weighs about 50 grams when suspended or supported by the CSF. The CSF also is responsible for transporting nutrients, chemical messengers, and waste products of the brain and the spinal cord. The cranial nerves. Here there are 12 cranial nerves. We will mention the primary function, origin, and destination of each cranial nerve. Number 1, the olfactory nerves, carrying the number 1, N1. Primary function, special sensory, smell. Origin, receptors of the olfactory epithelium. Destination, the olfactory bulbs. Nerve number 2, N2, is the optic nerve. Primary function, special sensory, vision. Origin, the retina of the eye. Destination, the diencephalons by the optic chiasm. Number 3, the oculomotor nerves, N3. Primary function, motor, eye movements. Origin, mesencephalon. Destination is divided to somatic motor, responsible for superior, inferior, and medial rectus muscles, inferior oblique muscle, and the levator palpebrae superioris muscles. The visceral motor is responsible for the intrinsic eye muscles. Nerve number 4, the trochlear nerves. Primary function, motor, eye movement also. Origin, mesencephalon. Destination, to one muscle, which is the superior oblique muscle. Nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerves. Primary function, mixed, sensory and motor to the face. Origin, the ophthalmic branch, the sensory one. Orbital structure, nasal cavity, skin of the forehead and upper eyelids and nose. The maxillary branch, sensory also, from the lower eyelid, upper lip, gums and teeth, cheek, nose, palate and pharynx. The mandibular branch, mixed, sensory from the lower gum, teeth and lips, palate and tongue. The motor from the motor nuclei of the pons. The destination, the ophthalmic and maxillary branches to the sensory nuclei in the pons, while the mandibular branch innervate the muscles of mastication. Nerve number 6, the abducens nerves. Primary function, motor, eye movement. Origin, pons. Destination, lateral rectus muscle. Nerve number 7, the facial nerves. Primary function, mixed, sensory and motor to the face. Origin, sensory from taste receptors on the tongue. The motor from motor nuclei of the pons. Destination, sensory to the sensory nuclei of the pons, while the somatic motor muscles of the facial expressions. The visceral motor innervates the lacrimal, tear glands, nasal mucus glands, submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. Nerve number 8, the vestibular nerve. Primary function, special sensory, balance and equilibrium, vestibular branch and hearing, cochlear branch. Origin, motor receptors of the inner ear, vestibular and cochlear. Destination, vestibular and cochlear nuclei of pons and medulla oblongata. Nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerves. Primary function, mixed, sensory and motor to the head and neck. Origin, the sensory one, from posterior 1/3 of the tongue, part of the pharynx and palate. Carotid arteries of the neck also. The motor, from the motor nuclei of the medulla oblongata. Destination, the sensory one, to the sensory nuclei in the medulla oblongata, while the motor, somatic, pharyngeal muscles involved in swallowing, visceral, parotid salivary glands. Nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. Primary function, mixed, motor and sensory, widely distributed in the thorax and abdomen. Origin, sensory, from the pharynx, part of the pharynx, pinna, and external auditory channel, diaphragm, and visceral organ in the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities. The motor branch, the origin, from nuclei in the medulla oblongata. Destination, sensory, fibers to the sensory nuclei and autonomic centers of the medulla oblongata. The motor, divided to the visceral fibers to the muscles of the palate, pharynx, digestive, respiratory, and cardiovascular systems in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Number 11, the accessory nerves. Primary function, motor to the muscles of the neck and upper back. Origin, motor nuclei of the spinal cord and medulla oblongata. Destination, medullary branch innervate spinal branch, control the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerves. Primary function, motor, tongue movement. Origin, motor nuclei of the medulla oblongata. Destination, muscles of the tongue. So that was all regarding the cranial neurons. Now, some simple information about the autonomic nervous system. In the autonomic nervous system, there is always a second visceral motor neuron interposed between the central nervous system and the peripheral effector. The visceral motor neuron in the central nervous system are known as preganglionic neurons. The axons of these neurons are called preganglionic fibers. The preganglionic fiber leave the central nervous system and synapse on a neuron in the autonomic ganglia. These are called ganglionic neurons. The ganglionic neurons control the peripheral effector, such as the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and glands. The axons of the ganglionic neurons are called postganglionic fibers. The autonomic nervous system is subdivided to, as we mentioned in our first lecture, sympathetic division and parasympathetic division. The two divisions have opposing effect. If the sympathetic division causes excitation, the parasympathetic causes inhibition. The sympathetic division with a fight or flight response. It causes heightened mental alertness, increased metabolism, increased metabolic rate, reduced digestive and urinary functions, activation of energy reserves, and also increased respiratory rate, dilatation of the respiratory passageways. Also, stimulation of the sympathetic division causes increased heart rate and blood pressure. Also, activation of sweaty glands. While the parasympathetic division stimulates visceral activity, it causes the rest and repose, and as following: it decreases the metabolic rate, decrease heart rate and blood pressure, increase secretion of salivary and digestive glands, increase motility and blood flow to the digestive glands, stimulation of urination and defecation. Thank you for your listening. This is the end of part 4 of the nervous system. Please, if you have any questions, send to my academic profile. Also follow this lecture on my YouTube channel. Bye-bye.